Hello, and welcome to the 92nd episode of the Jewish Drinking Show. I'm your host, Rabbi Drew Kaplan. I'm very excited to welcome first-time guest of the show, Adam Montefiore.
Thank you very much. Good to be here.
Absolutely. Is it Montefiore? Is it Montefiore? How do you pronounce it?
We say Montefiore. I know in America, some people say Montefiore. We say Montefiore. Okay. And of course, it's originally an Italian name. So that's where it comes from.
Yeah. It's a good thing I, asked for clarification.
Yeah. Yes, for sure.
For those less familiar with Adam Montefiore, he is a wine industry insider turned wine writer who has contributed to the advance of Israeli wines for 35 years. He is the wine writer for the Jerusalem Post. Previously, he worked many years for Israeli wineries and became arguably the most visual champion of Israeli wine in the wider world. He has been referred to as the ambassador of Israeli wines and the English voice of Israeli wines. He is also the author of The Wine Route of Israel, as well as Wines of Israel. So definitely an Israeli wine expert. So welcome.
An Israeli wine guy. I mean, it's a great honor to be invited on the show. Mm-hmm. And before we begin, I just want to say what an amazing show or podcast. I don't really know what you call it. I found it by accident.
Yeah.
And now I'm a fan. And I'm listening stage by stage to all the back episodes. And wow.
Thank you.
It's a great idea, much needed. And there's so much to learn and so much fun to listen in.
Thank you. I appreciate your approbations. It's wonderful to hear, especially for someone who's in the industry, like really actively engaged in it. So thank you. Thank you.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, it's great.
Okay, wonderful. So, all right. So we'll just get right into it. Like, you are an Israeli wine expert, and you know a lot about Israeli wine history. So I'm very curious, at least the contemporary, last couple of centuries, what's been going on in Israel. And I think for some people, a lot of people know that there's certainly nowadays there's a fair amount of kosher wine available that's coming out of Israel, but I don't think a lot of people know early 20th and certainly not 19th century history and the historical context for how, and certainly what's even going on right now, but certainly how do we even get to where we are now? So how did things get going in the modern times of Israel?
Well, if we start right at the beginning, mm-hmm. we start with a forebear of mine, Sir Moses Montefiore, mm-hmm. who is an English philanthropist who visited Israel 7 times.
Wow.
In 1839, he wrote that Jews should return to agriculture and the religious Jews should earn a living by working in agriculture rather than living off handouts. We've heard of that before. Mm-hmm. He said they should plant vines and olive trees. And it was something that was the first time Jews thought of agriculture for 2,000 years. I mean, it was the first time that someone flagged that up.
Yeah.
And of course, Moses Montefiore, he bought the first land for Jewish agriculture in 1855.
Where?
He built in Jaffa, Jaffa near Tel Aviv. Then Jaffa was there instead of Tel Aviv. It's today the Montefiore Quarter of Tel Aviv. He built the windmill, which was a symbolic building, which was to say, Ein Kemach, Ein Torah, Ein Torah, Ein Kemach. You have to work for a living. And it's now part of the skyline of modern Jerusalem, Western Jerusalem. Mm-hmm. And of course, he built the first modern neighborhood of modern Western Jerusalem, which was Mishkanot Shamim, the first neighborhood outside the old city walls. Mm-hmm. So I'm proud that Montefiore played the part in a call to return to agriculture and plant vines.
That's wonderful.
The first 3...
So what is your relationship to him?
He's my uncle 5 times removed. I'm 5 generations afterwards. I'm the first member of the family to make Aliyah after all these years.
Yeah.
And my 2 children are also in the wine trade. I have 3 children. 2 in Israel and 2 of them in the wine trade.
Wow.
So it's quite nice.
That's wonderful. Okay. So this is, and for a little bit of a context for him. So you said he set up stuff going on in Jaffa and then also this first settlement beyond the old city's walls in Yerushalayim. Did he set up a wine making stuff going on in Jerusalem, or mostly just in Yaffo?
No, he didn't in fact plant any vineyards.
Okay.
He encouraged people to go into to work, to plant vines, to return to agriculture. And it was Rothschild later that did the practical side, that planted the vineyards, Baron Edmund de Rothschild. So Moses Montefiore was more a prophet, foreseeing a Zionist before his time, he's been referred to. And straight after he said these words, wineries started forming. In 1840 was Ginio, a winemaker from Saloniki. In 1848 was the Shor family from the Ukraine. And in 1870 was the Teperberg family from Austria. So these were the first three basic small Jewish old city wineries,
so
serving mainly Kiddush wine and sweet wine for a religious population.
So in the 1830s, was there much of a move already underway of Jews going into agriculture and working the land in Israel? Or was he really trying to jumpstart it?
No, Jews didn't work agriculture. They bought grapes from the Arabs who owned vineyards in the Hebron area, which was the main grape growing area. And they had very good relationships with the Arabs. They bought local grape varieties, which are coming back now. We'll talk about them later, probably. So they didn't plant vineyards. They used what was existing, but they did make wine. And they did decide to that it was important. Wine was I believe that Jews throughout history in the Holy Land, Eretz Kodesh, they made wine, but it was a domestic affair. And we talk about these three that I mentioned because they lasted a long time. So we know about them. But I think most Jewish homes made wine so they could make Kiddush. So it was a domestic industry. There was no rabbinical organization. There were no labels. You made wine in a small cask. So you bought wine from a Yaakov. You knew he was a good Jew and you trusted him, and he was probably a relation, instead of looking at the kashrut certificate and knowing where you could buy wine. So it was a very interesting time for a religious Jew. There was no organized kashrut system for wine. There was for meat. It was a different issue. But for wine, it became far later. I know the Shor family was founded in 1848. They are today Israel's oldest existing winery. They have wineries today called Zion Winery and 1848 Winery. And there, I hear from the folklore of the family, they used to send the young girls, people with an empty glass bottle of wine. A family would probably only have one glass bottle, and they would send them to the winery to fill it up. And why the girls? Because the boys would be studying, the men would be studying, the women would be at home. And then the girls would cover it up with a bit of material on the walk back to the winery, because the winery was in the Muslim quarter, and they didn't want to inflame the Muslims by having alcohol, and they didn't want anyone non-kosher to look at the wine and make it treif. So this is the folklore of the family. A family had one glass bottle, and if they didn't have a glass bottle, they used to go and buy a small cask and buy that and take it home. So we know that from reading the sources that we have from that era, and it's quite interesting to think how different things were in those days.
Absolutely, yeah.
What wine was referred to as sweet or sour. So sour was dry or probably semi-dry, and sweet, we know what that was, and most of the wine was sweet. So again, it's an insight into wine at the time.
Yeah. And what you had mentioned earlier, a lot of the use seems to have been more for ritual purposes, Kiddush, Havdalah, rather than, right?
Yeah, I think most of it was for ritual purposes. Wine wasn't considered something, there's an old saying that Jews didn't drink. And it's taken, I don't know how many years for us to get a Jewish drinking podcast. So it's about time. But Jews didn't drink. Wine was associated very much with religion. It was in small quantities, and it was considered not cool to get drunk, as you know.
Yeah, very neat.
Hey there, I wanted to see how you're enjoying the episode so far. If you have any feedback, comments, questions, anything, please let me know. And also, if you have topics as well as potential guests, including, who knows, maybe yourself, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you, and now back into the show.
The Shor family, still going today, 8 generations afterwards, which is amazing. Producing great wine. But the first time we got Jewish vineyards was really when Baron Rothschild became involved in the 1880s, when they planted vineyards all over. I mean, there was a Jewish vineyard before called Kerem Avraham, but this was the first time that Jewish vineyards became an objective of the Yeshuvim all over the country.
So before 1882, they were just getting the grapes that the Arabs had harvested, and then they made them into wine?
Yeah, they got the grapes from Hebron, and they used them. Some people say they bought grapes in the local market, in the shuk, but there was no pretension to quality. It was just to make a wine that could be religiously used. And I believe in 1848, for the first time, barrels of wine were sent to America for the first export to America, which wouldn't have been allowed today because of the kashrut. Trying to stop up a barrel and then sending it on a ship. You don't know what happens to it on the ship. But the founding of a modern Israeli wine industry happened with Baron Edmund de Rothschild, who was from the famous Rothschild family. He owned Chateau Lafite, which is just about the most famous winery in the world.
Wow.
And he sent the top agronomists from France to Israel. He sent a Bordeaux winemaker to make the first wine. He built the 2 wineries with the 2 largest wineries in Israel with deep underground cellars at Rishon LeZion and Zichron Yaakov. But before that, in 1888 and 1889, was the first time the growers, the farmers, had to struggle with the problems of the biblical agricultural laws. And they had to struggle to know what to do with shemitah. They were very proud to observe the laws for the first time in, say, 2,000 years. I don't know how long. Ola, shemitah, kilei hakerem. But shemitah was the problem. And
we're in another shemitah year right now.
We're in another shemitah year right now.
Yeah.
So the big debate was what to do. So the more religious...
I was going to say that was 19 shemitah cycles ago.
It was 88, 89.
Right. So so that was exactly 19, because 20, it would have been 20 cycles ago that they founded the winery, 140 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I need a calculator to do things like that. You can do it in your head.
Yeah. So 19 shemitah cycles ago for those keeping score at home. Okay.
And it nearly tore the whole the first aliyah apart. There were some people that insisted, we're here after 2,000 years, we can observe shemitah. We don't want to not observe it. And Baron Edmund de Rothschild was more practical. He said, look, I'm investing a lot of money in these growers, in the wine industry. We need to come up with a compromise, because if we don't make wine 1 year, the whole enterprise will fall. And that's when they first came up with the compromise of the Heter Mechira, like they do at Pesach with the chametz.
So that was done. This was the catalyst for the Heter Mechira.
This was the catalyst for the Heter Mechira.
Wow!
It was the first time it was decided, and there was a storm. The Jewish world was in a storm about this. And funny enough, every shemitah after that, everyone took the Chet HaMechirah as read. It was all okay. There wasn't the great debate that there was in that first year. So it was a fascinating debate between modern practicality and observing the law to the nth degree. Because those that observed it thought, Rothschild will pay all the wages, he will pay all the salaries, we'll be profitable, whatever happens. But he didn't like it, and he got some pretty senior rabbis to come round to his view. So this was the first Chet HaMechirah.
Wow.
And today at Shemitah, we normally have a Chet HaMechirah, or we have a Otzer B'Din. And there's some wineries, for instance, the Zion winery that we talked about, don't make wine during a Shemitah year. So some wineries, adhere to the letter of the law. Others make whatever deal they decide to make with whether it's a Chet HaMechirah or Otzer B'Din, and they continue as normal. So apart from that, they continue as normal. So that was a fascinating time. Then Rothschild came and planted the vineyards, and Carmel, the root of Carmel is caramel, was the first caramel, God's vineyard. Was the first commercial winery, which was built in 1890. The first vineyards were from 1882, and Carmel distinguished itself by being eventually the first winery to make quality dry wines, but not world-class wines. I noticed in a previous podcast, they forgot Carmel. Although Carmel was way ahead of all the other Californian wineries in making dry wine. And the other thing about Carmel is 3 future prime ministers of Israel worked at Carmel, which is totally unique. Now, I've been in this business, I don't know how many years, and every time I give a talk or a tour, I mention the 3 prime ministers. And despite I've done this for so many years, every time I ask for people, give me 3 prime ministers that have worked for Carmel, no one ever has got the right answer, ever. So I will tell you for free who the 3 are. One was David Ben-Gurion. Second was Levi Eshkol, who worked in the vineyards surrounding Rishon LeZion. And the third, believe it or not, was Ehud Olmert. So I don't know many companies around the world that would have one prime minister, let alone 3 that worked for them.
It's funny, the middle one, Eshkol, I mean, that's his last name.
Yeah, sure. And he, of course, was an agriculturist. Ben-Gurion, it was just a job between jobs. But what's interesting about Ben-Gurion is he worked in the winery. And he caused a lot of trouble in the winery. People say he caused led the first strike. He was very competitive. And there's a story goes that he bet his colleagues that he could stand on the grapes, tread the grapes longer than they could. And he lasted 3 days nonstop.
Oh, wow.
Obviously with a break at night, I suppose. And he won his bet, but the smell of wine fermenting made him so nauseous, he couldn't drink wine for years afterwards.
Wow.
And it sounds like folklore, but it's in one of his books. So it must be true. But the interesting thing about that, Rabbi Drew, is that he worked in the winery and he wasn't a religious Jew. And so this brings me to another point. Now, today in a kosher winery, the workers all have to be shomer Shabbat. And they have to be approved by the rabbi of the winery. In those days, you didn't have to be shomer Shabbat. You could be religious. You could be Jewish, and they knew you were Jewish. And until the 1980s, it was lax. People who were Jewish could say, "Oh, I'll put on a kippah. I'll go into the winery and work," and it was okay. And I know this from Carmel, which was the be-all and end-all of kashrut in wine and the biggest winery. And it only started getting more competitive and stricter in 1983 with the founding of Shas, the Sephardi party. And suddenly kashrut started to become more competitive, started to have more business potential, and everyone started getting stricter. But before that, and this is very interesting because we discussed earlier with another post if Moses Montefiore drank kosher wine or non-kosher wine, kosher wine or non-kosher wine in the 19th century. And here we can see that kashrut in those days was laxer in terms of the people working in the winery until comparatively recently. So that's quite an interesting historical point.
Yeah, only within the last 4 decades. Wow.
Exactly, which is amazing. It's amazing.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I want to break in again, and if you have ideas beyond the show, beyond the podcast, beyond this video content, if you have ideas for what Jewish drinking can bring you, whether it's, who knows, maybe it's Zoom sessions, maybe it's events, maybe, who knows, swag, please let me know. I'm very curious to hear from you, any ideas, things that we can do, things that I can bring you from Jewish drinking. So feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. I'm happy to bring that to you. All right, now back into the show.
Rav Kook was a very important person because he was a person that made it okay for the religious Jew to work in agriculture in the secular Israel. So he, in fact, bridged the gap and made it okay for a group of people who weren't particularly Zionist to shed their worries about whether a secular state was good for them or not, and to work for the greater good. So it actually gave an impetus for everyone to be able to work with agriculture and the religious community as well. So he was a very important part in bringing religious Zionism into the framework and allowing the growers who were religious to feel that they were doing it for a good cause and not promoting a country that was secular, which many Haredim were against. So Rav Kook was a very important personality in smoothing over the barriers that were between some religious communities and the state of Israel.
I didn't know if it had any effect on the shemitah issue.
I don't think it did, but I researched and checked the rabbis that supported shemitah, but I can't remember them. I supported the compromise, but it was the first time that compromise was used, and from then on it became, the way of working together. There was always a solution, was the attitude.
I hope you've been enjoying this conversation, this episode with Adam Montefiore. I have good news and I have bad news. The bad news is that this is the end of this episode. I know, terribly sad, but I have great news in that this conversation and topic continues into the next episode, which I hope you join us for. And here's a sneak peek into that episode, still featuring Adam Montefiore.
The first famous dry red wine in kosher wine came in 1976. So we've jumped forward here.
That is a huge jump.
It was a huge jump. Yeah. Before that, the wines were semi-dry or sweet.
I hope you enjoyed that sneak peek to next week's episode, still featuring Adam Montefiore, and I hope you come back for a more contemporary history of modern Israeli wines. Thank you so much, and l'chaim.